talk about Lehman Brothers, Citigroup, etc.
Well, if they own part of the Federal Reserve Board system, which they do, they won't give you the names, by the way. It's secret.
Yes.
And the quantities owned, a lot of big bankers and also foreign bankers. I mean, the Rothschild family definitely owns a piece of the U.S. Fed, but it's hidden. So are the Rockefellers, and so are the Wahlbergs and the Kuhn-Loeb owners of that brokerage firm back in the 1913 when it was started. But the key is that they do benefit, but to different degrees, because again, they're getting 6% of whatever the Fed makes, and that 6%, to my knowledge, is distributed equally to the ownership of who owns the shares in the Fed.
But again, like Edwin said, it's actually a smaller part than the interest they charge on all the loans they give out.
Yes.
Basically doing nothing.
Yes, it is a smaller part, certainly. It's a monopoly that they can get money anytime they want and loan it out at higher rates, and they've got a window to borrow it.
Like
yes.
me having a printing press and printing $1,000 and then giving it to somebody and saying you have to pay me 5% for that.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
That also works.
And when the loan goes sour, you come back to the printing press and say, well, now bail me out because otherwise I'm going to go into
Go
collapse.
to the manufacturer.
Yeah.
Correct.
So, we talked about the history, we talked about the inherent instability. Now, Edwin and also you, Victor, you see some problems on the horizon that could make this end quite badly.
Well, in my case, I have made several speeches on this, and I think there's a YouTube video that is somewhere in the system that would show one of these speeches. But the point is, you've got stated debt of 17.5 trillion, and off-balance sheet about 10 trillion, and unfunded liabilities, it varies, but anywhere from 75 trillion to 200 trillion, depends who's giving you the estimates. No one would suggest, and even Janet Yellen and Ben Bernanke said this is sustainable, but no one stops it. So the key here is, for example, and I'll make a point, 1978 to 2013, the debt increase compounded. I pick an arbitrary. It doesn't have to. It could be 1975, 76, 80. It doesn't matter which one you pick. Long term is what I wanted. 36 years. Compounded increase in debt is 9.1% a year. If you look at GDP over that period, it's
Government debt.
U.S.
Liability.
government federal debt has increased to that 17.5 trillion. It was less than a trillion. It was about 775 billion to be exact in 1978. So that's a 9.1% compounded rate. Now, ask yourself, you're at 17.5. What is going to be the future debt that is going to, you can give me a number, but let's use half. Let's use half. In 10 years, it's 27 trillion. Now, if interest rates go back to their 53-year average, I picked 61, it's arbitrary, it doesn't matter what it is, it's just a number I know off the top of my head. The average interest rate, long-term, short-term, average them together up the yield curve, is 6.2. 6.2 of 27 trillion is about 30 to 35% of what the government will spend. And right now it spends 6% in interest. It's about 250 billion. This is because you have zero interest rates. It averages to about 1.5. And in 10 years, if it goes back to 6, which is average, it's not above average. It's not like the early 80s where it was 14, T-bills were 12. So you see it's unsustainable, so you have to go through either two things, bankruptcy or hyperinflation. My call is hyperinflation. When, the next question is, Victor, what date should I get out of the dollar? That I can't answer because, as I've said, many times, this is a psychological phenomenon. It's a run on the banks. If you read articles on hyperinflation, it has nothing to do with the printing of money like the 70s. This is people getting out of the money, and then the Fed taking over the monstrous task of supplying money for the debt that people are selling, plus the dollar is being sold by the debt in the form of the dollar by people like China and whoever else holds U.S. government debt. So that's my answer. Is the key is when, but it can't go on.
What about you, Edwin?
Well, the only thing I would add to that is that systems of this kind have invariably collapsed in depression. In the 19th century, 1800s, you saw depression after depression, financial stringencies, or hyperinflations, Weimar, Hungary, 1930s, or a combination of the two. Hyperinflation and depression, and they try to get out of it with hyperinflation, whatever, right? My question is, assuming that some sequence of events of that kind has to happen because these numbers are astronomical, what is going to be the social consequence? Well, if you have hyperinflation, you destroy the value of the currency unit. There is no other currency unit in this country. Let's not worry about the rest of the world, just this country. There is no other currency unit in this country, unless maybe you're up in Detroit and Windsor, you use the Canadian dollar, you're down in Juarez in Texas, and you can use the Mexican peso. But probably for 99% of the people in this country, they have no experience with any other currency unit than the so-called dollar, the Federal Reserve note. What happens when that goes to hyperinflation? The whole price structure goes with it. Production, transportation, distribution, consumption, all goes. Consequence of that, social dislocation, civil unrest, probably a great deal of civil disobedience, right? What's the response going to be from the powers that be in Washington, D.C.? Why, and I ask this question, why else did they create the Department of Homeland Security? It certainly wasn't to deal with terrorists in caves in Afghanistan. They've been fighting in Afghanistan for what, 13 to 14 years, and still haven't eradicated those terrorists, right? It certainly wasn't to keep illegal aliens out of this country. Doesn't do that at all. Its ultimate design is looking towards the question of social breakdown, because they're anticipating, this is like plan B. Their plan A is to try to keep this pyramid structure functioning long enough to replace as many of the faulty parts as they can and continue the scam. Plan B is, what if it comes down? And that's two words, martial law. That's plan B.
Just finished a book on that topic.
I just finished a book. It's at the printers now. It's called By Tyranny Out of Necessity, so you may get the idea. Subtitled, The Bastardy of Martial Law. Because if you look for martial law, as most people understand it, try to find it in the U.S. Constitution, you can't find it. It isn't there. In fact, in the Declaration of Independence, more of the grievances raised against King George III, which, according to the Declaration, singled him out as a tyrant, unfit to be the ruler of a free people, more of those related to martial law than to any other grievance. Right? But now they're obviously planning to do that. They've got the system set up through the Department of Homeland Security. They're paramilitarizing the police at the state and local level. They're running these operations such as occurred in Watertown, Massachusetts after the Boston bombing. 10,000 of these ninjas, I would call them, right? Paramilitarized police on the streets within a few hours of the bombing. They certainly didn't do that on an ad hoc basis. They were prepared for that. They were just waiting for some opportunity to test it out. And now they have generated the precedent. Because what happened there was a simple criminal act. Somebody set off a bomb. They were searching for a criminal suspect. They thought he might be armed and dangerous. Turned out he was neither of those, but they thought he was. How many times does that happen? Forget the bombing, but searching for an armed and dangerous criminal suspect. How many times does that happen every day across the United States, certainly in major urban areas? Dozens of times, probably every day. So now they have a precedent that when one of those situations occurs, they can put 2,000 armed paramilitary police into the streets.
And just DHS has 80,000 mercenaries. I call them mercenaries, not ninjas, but I'll take ninjas. But there's 80,000 of them. With $1.6 billion, they bought 1.6 billion rounds of hollow point 40 caliber, basically pistol and rifle, lock pistol bullets, if you will. And that's outlawed by several conventions overseas. They can't use them overseas. They can only use them here.
And what they did in Boston, though, was unconstitutional, raiding all those people's homes, right?
Oh, yes. They had no probable cause to go into those homes, certainly not to bring those people out at gunpoint, line them up out in the streets. There are some circumstances in which police who are in what they call hot pursuit of a fugitive, they see him going to the house, they might be justified under those circumstances to go into the house after him. But in this case, they had no idea where this fugitive was, and eventually he was found by somebody else. It wasn't even the police who found him. Right? But they've created the precedent, right? And now the average person has been conditioned to say, oh, when one of these events occurs, and that was a very small event, thousands of these armed paramilitary police can be put into the streets, and we have to comply with whatever they tell us to do. Well, how much worse would that be in an economic crisis where food is running out, the electricity may be shut down, you've got sanitation problems. You think of all the difficulties of essentially a third world nation being dropped immediately into New York City or wherever, Cleveland, Ohio. What's the response of the police on the one hand and the response of the average citizen on the other? Well, we've already seen it in Boston. Boston, which was the cradle of liberty in American history. It was outside of Boston, in Lexington and Concord, where the shot heard round the world was first fired. Right? And now we see it's come exactly full circle. They're all willing to just put their hands up and come out of their homes because somebody with a uniform and a gun pointed at them tells them to do it.
Okay, so maybe we'll go away from the doom and gloom for a bit. Are there any alternatives that politicians or market participants can pursue to stop this crisis from happening?
Yes, and Edwin, I'm going to hand the ball to him because he's got an answer if you just follow the Constitution. And why don't you talk about the militia?
Well, it's actually the constitutional structure has three levels to it. At the top, there's what's called the federal government. The founders would have called it the general government.